Is canceling or silencing a political opponent ever justified? Do two wrongs make a right? Herbert Marcuse, who was one of the main forces behind critical theory and one of the most important people in the century just past, thought that it was. But today, I will show you that no person of good faith and certainly no Bible-believing Christian in good conscience can ever agree. Welcome to Later Than You Think. I'm your host, Jeff Sidarius, and today we're going to do something different. We have been talking about neo-Marxism and its relationship to the woke movement and its underlying philosophy, critical theory, which is expanding rapidly throughout our world today. Now, the most important single individual in this link between neo-Marxism and what we see going on around us today is probably also the most important figure in the 20th century in this area, and that is Herbert Marcuse. As James Lindsay so very helpfully puts it, we are living in Herbert Marcuse's world, and there is so much truth to that. It is really impossible to overstate the influence that Marcuse had on the school of thinking that developed in the 1960s and has continued on until critical theory started expanding through the institutions, particularly academic institutions, in the 1990s. Just briefly, Marcuse came to America with the other members of the Frankfurt School when the Nazis came to power. Marcuse wound up at Brandeis University, Columbia University, and then later on, I believe, one or two schools on the West Coast. I'm not going to go into his history and background because James Lindsay does that in depth in his series of podcasts, which I'm going to link to in the show notes. And I strongly recommend that you listen to them for the history, the background on Marcuse's bio, if you will. What I want to do today is focus on his essay from 1965 called Repressive Tolerance. Very famous essay. It had a huge influence during the 60s, and I think you will see that its influence has survived the 60s, to say the least. And the reason I want to focus on this essay is that it shows, perhaps better than anything else I can think of, the link between neo-Marxism and the woke movement today. You read this essay, you understand what he's saying, you see very clearly why many of the things that have become very common in the public discourse in America following the George Floyd riots in 2020, you understand where these things come from. The deplatforming of conservative voices, the treatment of the January 6th protesters, for example, and many, many other examples that could be given. It all makes sense when you understand that people read this essay, they took it to heart, it became taught, it became discussed, and the reason it became so instrumental is because it provides what it claims is a justification for uneven treatment, unequal treatment of speech and thought and expression based on its content. For Marcuse, some speech is more equal than others, and therefore it is not only justifiable, but it is morally good to tolerate and promote the speech and opinions of one group and to suppress violently, if necessary, the speech and thought and opinions of other groups. Here is the thesis statement of Marcuse's essay as given by James Lindsay. Quote, movements from the left must be extended tolerance even when they are violent, while movements from the right must not be tolerated, including suppressing them by violence. Close quote. I believe that thesis statement is 100% accurate. I am going to link to Marcuse's essay in the show notes. I would invite you to perhaps pause the podcast at this point and go read the essay if you've never read it. I believe that you will see that Lindsay's summary is completely accurate. Now, I'm going to try to demonstrate to you that this summary is, in fact, an accurate summary of the piece. I'm not going to go into it in the detail that James Lindsay does, and I will simply leave you to his podcast. He goes through it sentence by sentence. I'm not going to do that, but I am going to try to hit the highlights and give you enough of the flavor of this to show you that, in fact, Lindsay's summary is accurate, and that is, in fact, what Marcuse is arguing for. Again, I would urge you to read the piece for yourself. It is hugely important in understanding today. I had to read it twice. I had to read it slowly. It's not an easy read, but it is worthwhile. Now, the essay is about the idea of tolerance. He starts out in the first paragraph and says, this essay examines the idea of tolerance in our advanced industrial society. And here's what he says about tolerance. I can't give you page references on this because the document I'm reading from does not have them, but this appears a couple of pages in. Quote, this tolerance cannot be indiscriminate and equal with respect to the contents of expression, neither in word nor in deed. It cannot protect false words and wrong deeds which demonstrate that they contradict and counteract the possibilities of liberation. Such indiscriminate tolerance is justified in harmless debates, in conversation, in academic discussion. It is indispensable in the scientific enterprise, in private religion. But society cannot be indiscriminate where the pacification of existence, where freedom and happiness themselves are at stake. Here, certain things cannot be said. Certain ideas cannot be expressed. Certain policies cannot be proposed. Certain behavior cannot be permitted without making tolerance, an instrument for the continuation of servitude, end quote. So what is he saying here? He's saying that we cannot help but discriminate against certain points of view because there are higher principles involved. If we let people speak freely, that might counteract the possibilities of liberation. What does he mean by liberation? Well, he's a neo-Marxist. He's talking about the kind of liberation from oppression that Marxism, and especially neo-Marxism, are entirely focused upon. Same is true when he uses the word servitude there. And I think you can see that basically what he's saying is that intolerance is okay if it serves the cause. And the cause is liberation from oppression in the Marxist sense. So, to serve this higher cause, cancel culture, as we see it around us today, is okay. In other words, it's morally justified. Now, in case there are any doubts in one's mind that this is actually what he is saying, I think when you get to about the middle of the article, roughly, and he gets to the heart of his argument, it becomes any doubts become removed. There's a paragraph starting out, quote, liberating tolerance, that's interesting, would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. As to the scope of this tolerance and intolerance, it would extend to the stage of action as well as of discussion and propaganda, of deed as well as of word. The traditional criterion of clear and present danger seems no longer adequate to a stage where the whole society is in the situation of the theater audience when somebody cries fire. It is a situation in which the total catastrophe could be triggered off by any moment, not only by a technical error, but also by a rational miscalculation of risks or by a rash speech of one of the leaders. End quote. So this is written in 1965, remember, at the height of the Cold War, when there was real concern that a nuclear disaster could happen any moment, nuclear war could break out. He's playing on that, and he's saying, look, the situation is just so dire that we can't afford these quaint notions of Western liberal Enlightenment tolerance. In other words, we have to get rid of the traditional liberal idea of tolerance, the one that is expressed in, I think, best in the words of Voltaire. I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That's traditional freedom of speech. But this, in Marcuse, is the exact opposite of that. Going on with that same passage, he says, quote, the whole post-fascist period, in other words, the post-World War II period, is one of clear and present danger. Consequently, true pacification, that is, liberation, again, in the Marxist sense, requires the withdrawal of tolerance before the deed, at the stage of communication in word, print, and speech. Such extreme suspension of the right of free speech and free assembly is indeed justified only if the whole of society is in extreme danger. I maintain that our society is in such an extreme situation, such an emergency situation, I should say, and that it has become the normal state of affairs. Different opinions and philosophies can no longer compete peacefully for adherence and persuasion on rational grounds. The marketplace of ideas is organized and delimited by those who determine the national and the individual interest. Then skipping a couple of sentences, I think this next sentence is the most important one. Quote, the small and powerless minorities which struggle against the false consciousness and its beneficiaries must be helped. Their continued existence is more important than the preservation of abused rights and liberties which grant constitutional powers to those who oppress these minorities. Close quote. So listen real carefully to what he says there. The minorities are struggling to achieve true liberating consciousness, and that struggle is so important that it's okay to do away with the rights of others. And the reason it's okay is because they're oppressing those minorities. And then going on in the next paragraph, he actually doubles down on this. Quote, withdrawal of tolerance from regressive movements, that is, conservative movements, before they can become active. Intolerance even toward thought, opinion, and word. And finally, intolerance in the opposite direction, that is, toward the self styled conservatives to the political right. These anti democratic notions respond to the actual development of democratic society, which has destroyed the basis for universal tolerance. Close. In other words, what he's saying is the evils of society make it necessary to censor certain voices, that is, those on the right. He goes on, the conditions under which tolerance can again become a liberating and humanizing force have still to be created. When tolerance mainly serves the protection and preservation of a repressive society, when it serves to neutralize opposition, in other words, repression, and to render men immune against other and better forms of life, like Marxism, he means, then tolerance has been perverted. And when this perversion starts in the mind of the individual, in his consciousness, his needs, etc., then the efforts to counteract his dehumanization, Marx talked a lot about humanizing man, his dehumanization must begin at the place of entrance, there where the false consciousness takes form, or rather is systemically formed. It must begin with stopping the words and images which feed this consciousness. To be sure, Marcuse goes on, this is censorship, even pre-censorship, but openly directed against the more or less hidden censorship that permeates the free media. Where the false consciousness has become prevalent in national and popular behavior, it translates itself almost immediately into practice. The safe distance between ideology and reality, repressive thought and repressive action, between the word of destruction and the deed of destruction, is dangerously shortened, close quote. Do you hear what he's saying here? He is saying very explicitly that two wrongs make a right. That's exactly what he's saying. He's saying this evil that's going on is so bad that we're going to have to do another evil to fix it, which is censorship. Does this make any sense? Absolutely not. Okay, one more. In about the middle of a paragraph that I think was added to the edition that I'm looking at, and it's in the document that I linked to, I believe that there is a natural right of resistance for oppressed and overpowered minorities to use extra legal means if the legal ones have proved to be inadequate. In other words, what he's saying, it's okay to break the law for these purposes, these so-called higher purposes. Law and order are always and everywhere the law and order which protect the established hierarchy. It is nonsensical to invoke the absolute authority of this law and this order against those who suffer from it and struggle against it, not for personal advantage and revenge, but for their share of humanity. Okay? I'm skeptical that most of the people who've been rioting of late are doing it for the good of humanity, but let's leave that aside for a moment. He goes on, there is no other judge over them than the constituted authorities, the police, and their own conscience. If they use violence, they do not start a new chain of violence, but try to break an established one. End quote. So there we go. We can use violence, we can break the law in order to bring about this so-called better world. Two wrongs make a right. And I think what's really being done here, he's using past oppression, past grievances to justify violating the law in the present. And the problem with that is that past grievances, real or imagined, are always going to be available as things you can point to justify your actions in the present. There's a never-ending store of those. And it's very convenient for tyrannical rulers and people who want to control the narrative to point to those and say, oh, these bad things happened in the past, so therefore I can justify the bad actions that I'm taking now because look at all this bad stuff that happened in the past. Now, what are we to make of all this? How does this stack up to what the scripture says? There are always going to be some grievances, whether they're real or whether they're imagined, in the past that one can point to in order to provide purported justification for discrimination in the present. Why is that? Well, it's obvious. We're all sinners. Marcuse's thinking and the thinking of critical theory and the woke movement only generates perpetual grievances and past horrors which are never fully resolved and cannot be forgiven. But they do serve a purpose. They provide a handy tool for tyrants to villainize their political opponents endlessly. Just look what that guy did. Isn't it horrible? It's just so horrible that he or she cannot be allowed to even speak. Here's another problem with this essay. If you carry this reasoning to its logical conclusion, then you would have to conclude that it is the woke that have to be suppressed today. They are the ones that are in control of the media. They are the ones that are in control of academia by and large, and they are the ones who are largely in control of much of the corporate world. So by Marcuse's logic, they are the ones who should be suppressed, and the minority on the right, those are the ones who should be promoted. But don't expect Marcuse's followers in today's woke movement to ever follow their own logic for this very simple reason. They are not, first and foremost, high-minded philosophers, which is how Marcuse tries to pass himself off in this essay. They are first and foremost and always political activists. Remember, Marx taught that the point of philosophy, and specifically the point of his philosophy, was not to understand the world, but to change it. And the goal of their political activism is to do whatever they have to do, which includes, if necessary, lying to you and deceiving you in order to gain their objective, which is total power. That is why they do not behave consistently with their own logic. Consistency, they will tell you, is the hobgoblin of small minds. Here is another reason why Marcuse's thesis is fatally flawed. What he and his neo-Marxists and his followers in today's critical theory woke movement are trying to justify is a return to the pagan world of you hurt me, I'll hurt you, tit-for-tat violence. It's the world that civilization, Western civilization, has emerged out of. What he's really calling for is an endless cycle of violence that begets violence. You hurt me, then I'll hurt you back. And then the person who's been hurt back says, well, you hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you back. And it goes on and on and on forever. We're all familiar with that. The Hatfields and the McCoys, many other examples throughout history. And that's not going to lead to utopia, as Marcuse claims. It's not. It's obviously going to lead not to heaven, but to hell on earth, as it has throughout the 20th century and is continuing into this century. obviously taking away freedom of speech from those who have it, or at least those who are guaranteed to have it under the Constitution, like ours, thankfully. Just the same as it would be in the case of taking away private property, which the Marxists also want to do. It's going to inevitably lead to a bloody conflict, a bloody revolution. Marcuse conveniently overlooks this. Christianity, when it came into the world, put an end to, or began to at least, this historical cycle of violence for violence. Marcuse wants to go the other direction. He wants to go backwards, even though he claims to be progressive. It's not progressive, it's regressive. It's all a lie. So what is the answer? Well, the answer is that man needs a new heart. He doesn't need some deliberately tilted or slanted playing field or the muzzling of certain kinds of speech. It is only when he has a new, renewed heart that this desperate cycle that Marcuse's repressive tolerance proposes, this repeated suppression of and retribution against one's political opponents, that this is the only way that cycle has any hope of being broken. You remember that Jesus said, love your enemies, do good to them that hate you. How is this possible? Well, it's only possible by seeing how truly sinful we are and how immense is the forgiveness that we have from God through Christ. But there is no forgiveness. There is no redemption, no possibility of redemption in the false religion that Marcuse advocates. But that's not all. This essay is replete with classic Marxist non-ethics, or I would say anti-ethics. Let me give you one example. About halfway through the essay, he says, quote, in terms of historical function, there is a difference between revolutionary and reactionary violence, between violence practiced by the oppressed and by the oppressors. In terms of ethics, both forms of violence are inhuman and evil. But since when is history made in accordance with ethical standards? Close quote. In other words, he's thumbing his nose at ethical standards. Now, as I mentioned, again, this is all presented by Marcuse in a way that sounds very high-minded and very academic. He, over and over in the piece, professes to have great concern about the plight of the poor and oppressed minorities. And this is, quite frankly, what engages with many people, particularly younger people, who naturally see suffering and want to do something about it. Marcuse tries clearly and repeatedly to try to play to that audience, so to speak. But here's what we have to remember. First, we need to step back for a moment and look at the big picture. Remember, we talked about this. The neo-Marxists were trying to figure out why the revolution that Marx predicted had not spread to the industrialized world by and large. And what they decided was that the workers were just not good enough at driving the conflict with the proletariat. The proletariat was not good enough at driving the conflict with the bourgeoisie that was necessary to create the conflict which would bring about the revolution. So they had to go look somewhere else, and where they landed on was poverty, race, and to some extent sex-based discrimination as wedge issues to create the conflict that would drive the revolution that would bring about heaven on earth. So when we remember that, and we remember that Marxist ethics are really that the ends justify the means, then we can see that it makes sense of what Marcuse is doing in this essay. Second, as Christians, we always subject any philosophy, any worldview to the grid of Scripture. And we have to do that here as well. We need to beware of appeals to emotions. We do this because our emotions, our heart, can lead us astray. It's also true that we have to understand history. Those who do not understand history are condemned to repeat it. When our founding fathers put freedom of speech up front in the Bill of Rights, that was not an accident. They had seen in the history of Europe in the centuries before them what happens when speech is given freely to one group and another group has it taken away. And they saw clearly that free speech must be extended to everyone and not just some, or it will be lost eventually to all. Why is this? Well, think about it for a minute. If you're going to say that some people or some group of people in the society should not be allowed to speak freely, who's going to decide who that group is? Who's going to decide what they can say and what they can't say? Well, very quickly, everything devolves into a power struggle. And that is why free speech must be available to all members of the society, or it's not truly free speech at all. Free speech is, of course, one of the bedrock foundations of Western civilization. And when you read Marcuse in this essay and in his other writings and the other writings of the neo-Marxists, as well as the critical theory writers of today, they explicitly want to dismantle these foundations of Western civilization because they want to dismantle civilization itself. If you think I exaggerate, stick around. We'll get the documentation. It's all publicly available out there. It's readily available, and we'll put it in the podcast. Now, last and by far the most important of everything I've said about this essay is what I'm about to say. In Romans chapter 3, verse 8, Paul both identifies and explicitly condemns what Marcuse is doing in this essay. I need to set this up briefly. In this passage, which I'm going to read in a moment, Paul is answering an objection. It's the same objection. It's stated several different ways, but it's basically this, probably coming from a Jewish person. And the substance of the objection is, okay, Paul, if you say I'm a sinner, and if God receives glory in the midst of my sin, or as a result of it, because his character stands out and shines out against my sin, then how can he punish me for that sin? In other words, how can God punish me for a sin from which his own glory results? Okay, now let me read the passage, starting at Romans 3, verse 5. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means, for then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? Then verse 8, and why not do evil that good may come, as some people slanderously charge us with saying, their condemnation is just. In this verse, Paul rejects the idea that we should do evil in the hope that good will come from it. But that is, of course, precisely what Marcuse advocates in this article. He advocates that we should repress conservative thought and speech in order that eventually some greater good, liberation, pacification, utopia will come from it. Good things never result from doing evil, only more evil things. This is a universal principle that is recognized throughout civilized society and has been for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Let me leave you with the comment on this verse written by Albert Barnes, which sums it up phenomenally well. Quote, "Thus he," that is Paul, "teaches as a great fundamental law that evil is not to be done that good may come." This is a universal rule, and this is in no case to be departed from. Whatever is evil is not to be done under any pretense. Any imaginable good which we may think will result from it, any advantage to ourselves or to our cause, or any glory which we may think may result to God, will not sanction or justify the deed. Strict, uncompromising integrity and honesty is to be the maxim, the rule of our lives. And in such a life only can we hope for success or for the blessing of God. Close quote. My friends, as we have seen from this discussion, the ideas in this essay are poisonous, frankly, and the fruit of the poisonous tree can be seen all around us today. These ideas are dangerous, they are immoral, and they are antithetical to civilization itself. We need to see these ideas for what they are, and as I said, they have permeated our society in an amazing way and to an extent that very few would have thought possible even a few years ago. We need to see them, we need to call them out, we need to resist, and we need to do it now because it is much later than we think. For comments and feedback, you can email me at diggingfordiamonds99@gmail.com. Join us next time as we resume our look at the roots of the woke movement.